Does what goes on in the sky have an effect on us down here? Does a solar eclipse predict the future? Let's see what Rabbi Krish has to say. This is Faith Meets Fact.
The Torah has some very strong opinions about natural phenomena. Let's start with rainbows. Rainbows are horrible. God put rainbows in the sky to remind himself not to try to destroy the world again, as he did during the biblical flood. Every time we see a rainbow, this is supposed to be a sign of intense divine displeasure, bordering on the destruction of the world itself, where God essentially stops himself right before destroying everything. Rainbows, very bad sign, one of the worst omens you can possibly see. Eclipses are not much better. The Talmud in Tractate Sukkah says that if you see a solar eclipse, that's a sign, a bad omen, for all of the Gentile nations. And if we see a lunar eclipse, that is a bad omen for the entire Jewish people, unless they follow the will of God to a T. It would seem that both rainbows and eclipses are very bad news for anyone who sees them. But any scientist will tell you that both rainbows and eclipses are predictable natural phenomena. There's nothing particularly mystical about a rainbow or an eclipse. Both are basically the same light show done a little bit differently. It's all about bending light. A solar eclipse happens when the moon slips between the earth and the sun, casting a shadow that briefly turns night into day. A lunar eclipse is the reverse. The earth gets between the sun and the moon, plunging the moon into darkness. Rainbows, meanwhile, are a refraction show. Sunlight enters raindrops where it bends and reflects until it splits into an arc of color. One is a perfect alignment of celestial bodies, the other a perfect alignment of light and water. Neither are supernatural phenomena. And while predicting rainbows more than a few days or a few hours out is not necessarily possible, predicting eclipses based on what we know about the movement of the celestial bodies is not only possible, but very, very accurate at this point. Scientists are able to predict every eclipse that is going to happen down to the second. That's a pretty big conundrum. How can the Torah claim that eclipses and rainbows are signs of divine displeasure when they are highly predictable natural phenomena? This entire situation is complicated by the fact that the rabbis themselves, who claimed that rainbows and eclipses are supernatural phenomena, were well aware of the fact that they were also predictable natural phenomena. The rabbis are aware of the problem. Ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Seneca were well aware of how rainbows form, and there is ample evidence in the Talmud that the rabbis were well aware of the science of Greece. Furthermore, astronomers in Babylon were well aware of how to predict eclipses with fair accuracy. There's something known as the Saros cycle that appears to have been able to predict eclipses back in 100 BCE. It's very unlikely that the rabbis were unaware that eclipses were predictable natural phenomena, and nonetheless claimed very clearly that these are signs of divine displeasure, which brings us to our real question. How can something be both a sign of divine displeasure and a predictable natural phenomena? Or put another way, what do you do when superstition meets science? Some sages have proposed that this just means that God knows in advance when we're going to sin and set up predictable natural omens, eclipses, rainbows, as signs of divine displeasure or signs of incoming divine punishment, knowing in advance that by then we deserve it. This approach leaves something to be desired and is a little bit unsettling because it seriously runs up against free will. It would certainly infringe upon my free will to see a rainbow or an eclipse and then feel that it is my destiny, God forbid, to do a sin. A stronger approach is that God only creates conditions for seeing omens when we deserve to see them. This works very well for rainbows, which are not predictable all that far out. When God wants to show us signs of divine displeasure, he can create the weather conditions that will lead to a rainbow on the spot in response to what we do. In this way, there would be no contradiction between science and Torah. This would be a classical case of God using nature to communicate with us. But this does not help us with eclipses. The Talmud implies that an eclipse is a bad omen whether or not we see it. Meanwhile, NASA can predict every single eclipse that will happen down to the second. If eclipses occur on a schedule and are bad news whether or not we see them, we're going to need a little something more to resolve this particular conflict. An approach that understands eclipses as predictable natural phenomena without sacrificing anything in the Talmud's understanding of eclipses as bad omens can be found in the works of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Rebbe explains that an eclipse is a divine warning that a particular hour will be dominated by an evil constellation. Our worst personality traits will surface and we'll face our greatest challenges on a personal and national level. We needn't fear an eclipse because we have free will and we're capable of rising above our animalistic urges. At the same time, eclipses have been scheduled throughout time as specific moments where we are going to face our greatest challenges and will need to rise to the occasion. So are eclipses an omen? Absolutely, but they are also predictable natural phenomena. There is no contradiction here between science and Torah.
Thank you, Rabbi Krish. Join us next time as we tackle a different area in the science world. Is there archaeological evidence for stories in the Torah? Could we prove the splitting of the sea? Or the giving of the 10 Commandments at Sinai? Or do we have to accept these stories with blind faith? We'll see you next time on Faith Meets Fact.